All right. Everyone, please accept my apologies. I had some major computer problems this morning, but I wanted to welcome all of you to this launch meeting. And my name is Talia, and I am not usually quite this disorganized, but I wanted to thank you so much for joining us today. I am a board member, and on behalf of everyone at CureSHANK, I want to welcome you all and thank you for attending our consortium launch meeting. We are looking forward to an informative presentation and fruitful discussion. But before we begin all of that, we want to start with a reminder of the reason we are all here. The very high level of unmet need created by Phelan-McDermid syndrome, or PMS, in the lives of real people. So to start off with, we're going to share with you the first two in a series of short videos that CureSHANK is developing to highlight the various and devastating symptoms PMS can cause. We will provide more information about this video project a little later today, but for now, we just wanted to give you a peek into our world. The first video is about Darius, who is the son of CureSHANK co-founder and treasurer, Abby Levency.
Hi, I'm Abby. My only child, my son Darius, has Phelan-McDermid syndrome. The toughest part of this diagnosis for us has been experiencing regression. Despite Darius's genetic diagnosis, he was doing quite well. At age 2, Darius was able to put silverware away. Notice here, when he's done putting away the first batch, he says, "more," as he returns to get more. Darius could also feed himself with a spoon. At 3, Darius could drink water from a regular cup without spilling. You're so silly. And he was pretty great at shooting a basketball. Yay! Good job, buddy! But sadly, one by one, Darius's skills and interests and all the potential he had in life were robbed from him. Around the age of 6 is when all these skills began to vanish. Where does the spoon go? Where does the spoon go? No, try again. The spoon, no, you have to use your eyes. You have to use your eyes to look. Oh, buddy. Can I have the cup? Can you swallow what's in your mouth? Can I have the cup, Darius? Can I have the cup? Additionally, he craves motion, even if it's not productive, like pacing back and forth in the house with no particular rhyme or reason. Although we're unable to pinpoint any specific event that may have happened or caused this regression, it happened, and it's heartbreaking. I was driven to join in the formation of CureSHANK with other similarly situated parents with one goal in mind: to accelerate research, to help my son Darius and all others that suffer with this dreadful condition a chance for a brighter tomorrow.
This next one that we're going to share is about my own son, Asa, who has struggled with, over the past year, self-injurious behaviors. it reached a point that if we had let him, he would have hit himself in the head hundreds, if not thousands of times a day. Until he was 1 year old, there was pretty much no indication of any real problem. He was happy, he was healthy, a really sweet little guy. We could tell something was going on. He was just not understanding language. That was how we ended up eventually finding out that he had a single letter mutation causing Phelan-McDermid syndrome. Started out really mildly. He would start doing this like perfectly calm, but then he would start doing it harder and harder. And the thing is, he would do it fast. And so he could be across the room and he could hit himself 20 times before you could get to him. He has a high pain tolerance, part of the syndrome usually. It was escalating. He would bang his head on the floor, on the wall, on a door. He would hit his head with his fist. He might have a really huge meltdown. You just had to restrain him because he's fighting and fighting and fighting to be able to get out of our grip so that he could hurt himself. I'm in a bunch of Facebook groups and I've seen some scary stuff. One particularly horrifying one is this mom whose son has rendered himself blind from hitting his head so much, because if you do it too much, you can detach your retinas and then you can't see anymore. There's a lot of things that you don't realize that you assumed would be a certain way until you know that it won't. Always thought he would call me mom. There's only a handful of words that he understands outside of visual cues. Whatever he does have is entirely a result of doing hundreds or thousands of repetitions. CureSHANK is dedicated to accelerating the development of treatments for Phelan-McDermid syndrome, a treatment that could create appreciable differences in his quality of life and ours would be amazing. And even more amazing would be something that we can identify in babies and start treating them right away and have them not go down this path that Asa and all these other kids have had to go on. This genetic disorder has robbed him of having friends and having meaningful relationships. The moments that are amazing are things like he looked into my eyes and smiled the other day, and I was like, there you are. This disorder has made it so that I don't know him either, really. I would really like to know my child. And now, I'm dry my eyes. I would like to introduce, and I'm honored to introduce somebody that many of you already know, Geraldine Bliss, who is a CureSHANK co-founder and president. And she is going to start her presentation by telling you some about her story, or rather her son Charles's story, and everything that they have gone through over the past couple of decades.
Thanks, Talia. Those are powerful stories, aren't they? Just take that and multiply it by that by 3,000. There is so much suffering in our community. When Charles was a baby, we had no idea that anything was amiss. He was happy and healthy and developing normally as far as we could tell. I mean, very much like Asa in that regard. Here you can see him learning to walk at 9 months of age. This really was like the happiest time in my life. Every day, I just woke up looking forward to seeing his smiling face and witnessing his curiosity and his sense of wonder. Next slide, please. Around 18 months, I was concerned about how few intelligible words Charles was using. At the age of 2, he was finally referred for speech therapy through early childhood intervention, and he was diagnosed with apraxia of speech. A year later, he was diagnosed with ADHD and then with autism. At the age of 6, when chromosomal microarray became available, he was referred for testing and we learned he had Phelan-McDermid syndrome, or PMS for short. That was a very important diagnosis for us because it helped us make sense of what had happened. These were very hard years filled with a lot of tears, and, as we struggled with many behavioral challenges and communication difficulties. With the support of all his amazing teachers and ABA therapists and speech and occupational therapists, we saw good progress. It was a lot of work. By kindergarten, Charles learned to speak and used several hundred words. He could tell me some facts about his day. He could recite rhymes, answer simple questions, and comment on things around him. He was learning to write and to read by sight and by decoding. And I had good reason to feel hopeful about his future. Next slide. At the age of 8, everything changed. Charles had his first generalized tonic-clonic seizure, followed by another one the next month, and then another. He was diagnosed with epilepsy. Within half a year, he was experiencing like dozens to hundreds of seizures every day, mostly drop seizures, and he was diagnosed with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Lennox-Gastaut, it is one of the most devastating forms of epilepsy. Charles quickly began losing skills that we had fought so hard for. It was as if we had gotten on the elevator, push the button for the 18th floor, the doors close, and instead of going up, the elevator starts going down faster and faster. And finally, the elevator stops and you think you've gotten to the bottom. And just when you think the doors are going to open, the elevator starts crashing again. And that is the feeling we had. It felt like this endless downward path. And every time we thought we had gotten to the bottom, we discovered we hadn't. There was a place that was even lower, if possible. We were in crisis. We completely reoriented our lives. Instead of fighting for gains in speech, we were fighting to keep Charles alive. Charles spent weeks at a time in the hospital where his doctors tried one medication after another to get his seizures under control. Sitting bedside in the hospital, I wondered, why couldn't we have precision medicines that targeted the underlying molecular problems? Why should trial and error be the accepted approach for treating patients with PMS? That idea is what drew me into research advocacy. Next slide. By his teenage years, our lives changed significantly. In these photos, you can see the physical impact of seizures, like broken nose and smashed in teeth, bloody wounds, and bruises were frequent occurrences. We were making at least one trip to the emergency room every month, if not more than that. What you can't see here is the social stigma of wearing a helmet and a gait belt. His schoolmates didn't understand it was to protect his head. They thought he wore a helmet with a face mask because he would bite them. It made me sad to think of all the things people could think about Charles that they would assume he was dangerous or scary, right? It was yet another way that Charles's disability prevented his acceptance and inclusion. School assigned Charles a one-to-one nurse because of the difficulty of managing his seizures in the school setting. Life changed for everyone in our family. It became impossible for our family to go out to social gatherings. Getting to our other child's activities necessitated a divide and conquer approach where my husband would go one way and I would go the other. My husband had to pivot his whole vision for his small business because of the new demands on his time and because of the great expenses driven by Charles's medical needs. Really, it became about doing whatever we had to survive, just one day at a time. Next slide, please. Now, at almost 24 years of age, Charles continues to have about 200 seizures per month. He has many other complicated medical problems. He needs support for all activities of daily living. Despite all these challenges, Charles still has that spark of joy. I love this picture of him, right? There's just a half smile, but you can see a little twinkle in his eyes. On his good days, he has a beautiful smile and a joyful spirit. I want him to have a better life, to be a little more independent and autonomous, to be able to express himself and advocate for himself, to have friends and a life outside of just our family, to be free of as many medical problems, and to experience less suffering. That brings us to CureSHANK. Let's go to the next slide. My co-founders, Abby Levency and Paulina Rychenkova, and I brought CureSHANK to life because we believe that a better life for our children is possible, and it's going to happen through the development of treatments that can restore SHANK3 function. And I'm not sure why my image isn't showing up here. Our mission is very focused and narrow by design. Our approach is to identify and fund projects that overcome critical barriers to successful drug development and to coordinate scientific efforts to improve efficiency and speed in the field. That's it. That's all we do. So we're fortunate to have great collaborative relationships with the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Foundation. And I believe today we're joined by the Foundation's Executive Director, Ronnie Blumenthal, and Scientific Director, Kate Still, as well as the SHANK2 Foundation, the Rare Epilepsy Network, the Alliance for Genetic Etiologies and Neurodevelopmental Disorders in Autism, and Combined Brain. Our partnerships with these organizations enable us to accomplish much more than we would otherwise be able to do. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. I am going to take a little pause now while we welcome you to the CureSHANK Consortium launch meeting. We are delighted to have you here today. Now that we've shared a little bit about the disease burden and unmet need in PMS, we want to tell you about CureSHANK and our activities. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, for whatever reason, I'm not seeing all the content that is supposed to be.
Do you want me to start sharing screen? And also we cannot hear you.
Yes, sorry. What had happened was that some of the formatting didn't copy over, but I have the other version. So give me 1 second.
How about I just keep talking while you pull that up? Okay. Basically, on this slide, we have a list of CureSHANK's board members and advisors. So here's who comprises CureSHANK. It's in addition to Talia and Abby, whose stories you heard, we also have Paulina Rychenkova. Talia recently joined our board of directors. Paulina, Abby, and I are the co-founders. And we are extremely grateful for our amazing strategic and scientific advisors who have generously given of their time. They include Doctors Brett Abrams, Jamil Beg, Federico Bolognani, Shafali Jeste, Walt Katoniak, and Morgan Shang. They have been essential in helping to craft the vision for CureSHANK and for helping us determine what activities will yield the greatest value for the field. So I hope that the why of our work and the reason that we're doing all of this is apparent from the videos at the beginning that we showed you. It's a really tough disorder with a heavy burden on patients and caregivers, siblings, teachers, everybody who's involved in their lives. I want to stress that there are no FDA approved treatments for Phelan-McDermid syndrome. So for most families, the approach is really truly a trial and error strategy, much like we've ended up using for Charles in the treatment of his epilepsy. Oh, great. Okay. Yeah, this is the why we are doing our work. Okay. Perfect. So most of you are already very familiar with SHANK3. It's located on the terminal end of chromosome 22. The loss of SHANK3 affects synaptic transmission and plasticity. And disruption in the normal function of SHANK3 causes the core neurodevelopmental deficits in PMS. Let's go to the next slide. We've had over 20 years of robust research on SHANK3 and about 13 years of concentrated efforts to understand the effects of the loss of SHANK3 in human disease. There are a multitude of well-characterized model systems, and there have been important discoveries that have brought the field to the dawning of clinical trials. Next slide. Again, our mission is to accelerate the development of treatments for SHANK-related disorders, which starts with clinical trials. To increase the likelihood of many successful clinical trials, CureSHANK has identified 4 core projects. Let's go to the next slide. So I don't have to belabor the point. In disorders of the brain, clinical trials have been fraught with challenges: how to measure outcomes. Are there biomarkers that can tell us if new medicines are getting into the brain or if they are changing the disease state? And gaining regulatory acceptance for new technologies. Treatments are urgently needed. Families are just making do with Band-Aids while their lives are falling apart. Every day that it takes to develop a new treatment means another day that our children slip backwards. Time is truly of the essence. We've therefore prioritized 4 projects to create a smooth, fast runway for companies who wish to conduct clinical trials in PMS. So let's go to the next slide. I am delighted to introduce Dr. Federico Bolognani, who is one of CureSHANK's advisors, and he is going to discuss project number 1.
Okay, so while we wait for the slides, I will start presenting our activity around. Oh, here it is. Okay. Yeah. So as you all know, for the success of any clinical trial or research project, is critical to really have an optimal method to measure the effects of whatever intervention we are testing. And sometimes I wonder how many opportunities were missed that could have benefited the patients, but trials failed because we didn't have good instruments to actually measure positive change in the patients. So what I would like to emphasize here is that sometimes this work is a little bit boring, the fact that we have to develop clinical endpoints, but this is critical for the success of any clinical trial. We must have instruments that can accurately measure the positive changes that we are looking into the patients. So one of the things that we have identified at CureSHANK is the need to start building all the elements that we need to have a very good measurement strategy for future clinical trials in Phelan-McDermid syndrome. So if we move to the next slide, the good news is that it is very clear and what is needed for an instrument to be optimal for its use in a clinical trial. And actually, the health authorities, especially the Food and Drug Administration, has been very clear on what type of framework is needed for a good measurement strategy in a clinical trial. And we can summarize that strategy outlined by the FDA as depicted in this slide, that first, we need to identify what to measure in the patients. So we need to identify which concepts and what concepts are relevant for the patients, for the caregivers, and develop a conceptual model or a conceptual framework to identify, what elements, what parts of the phenotype of the patients are important to measure in the clinical trial. So that's the starting point of any measurement strategy for clinical trials. Of course, then after you identify the concepts that you want to measure, then you can create new instruments to measure those concepts, or maybe even better, identify existing instruments that will actually provide good measurements of those concepts. Of course, then after that, we need to analyze how those instruments perform in the patient population that we are targeting. We may need to modify, improve, and refine those instruments, and then go back to the conceptual model or the conceptual framework to see whether we need to revise that. So this is an iterative process, but everything starts with identifying which concepts are relevant for the patients and for the caregivers. So at CureSHANK, what we had done is to start this process by developing a conceptual model of what it means to be living with Phelan-McDermid syndrome. So if we move to the next slide, without going into the details, but our strategy is really to share the conceptual model of Phelan-McDermid with the community, and we can share the details. But basically, what we did was a very structured literature review to really identify, all the characteristics, all the signs of people living with Phelan-McDermid syndrome. But not only that, but also to identify, according to the caregivers, what's the impact on the patients themselves, and also what's the impact on the caregivers. So we know that this type of conditions do not only affect, the person having the condition, but also affect, the caregivers and the family. So we have built a very robust conceptual model of the condition, and we believe that this is the starting point for starting to identify or develop, instruments that can actually measure all these different concepts that are relevant for people living with Phelan-McDermid syndrome and their caregivers. So thank you very much, and if there's any questions, I would be more than happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Federico. Following today's meeting, we will circulate a link, and we've put the conceptual model on CureSHANK's website, and we will circulate that to everyone. Great. Well, if we go to the next slide, I am so pleased to introduce Larry Bauer. He is a senior regulatory drug expert at Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara. And Larry is going to discuss project number 2.
Yes, thanks so much, Geraldine. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. My name's Larry Bauer. I work at a law firm that we do a lot of consulting work, mostly on FDA-related issues. My background is I was at the FDA for 10 years. I was a regulatory scientist there, and I was one of the co-founders of the Rare Diseases Program within CDER with Dr. Ann Pariser back in 2010. While I was at the agency, one of the things that was developed during that time was a process called patient-focused drug development. So as the FDA was reviewing new drugs and working with drug companies as they were developing new products, they realized that there was an important voice that was missing from the process. Historically, most drugs were developed by listening to drug companies, physicians, maybe clinical experts. And there was one part of the equation that wasn't there, and that was hearing directly from patients and caregivers, the people who are actually experts on the condition. And the FDA, they had several mechanisms where they were trying to do that, but they realized that they needed a more structured way of doing it. So they came up with a process in 2012 called patient-focused drug development. And these were a series of meetings that the FDA held. They lasted for most of a day long, and they were meeting with patients and caregivers with a variety of different diseases and conditions, some rare, some common. And the purpose of the meeting was to listen to and learn from patients and caregivers about the disease from their perspective. So the FDA conducted 26 of these meetings. They found the process to be very successful, but they realized that they could not continue to do this for all the, there's over 7,000 rare diseases. So if you just talk about rare diseases, they thought, that it would be too overwhelming. So they turned the process over to patient advocacy organizations, and the meetings became externally led patient-focused drug development meetings. So that was external to the FDA. The FDA continues to help plan the meetings. There's actually several devoted staff at the FDA that work with advocacy organizations. And so the process continues with FDA support, but the meetings are organized by the groups. To date, there have been about 55 of these externally led meetings. Some of them have been for common diseases, but most of them have been for rare diseases. And the goal, once again, is to listen and learn from patient and caregivers. They tend to be, we've been doing meetings, like they tend to go from like 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. The day is divided into 2 main topics. The first topic is, what kind of symptoms do people experience, and how do those symptoms impact their lives? So we want to hear in great detail, covering all aspects of the disease. And then the second topic that we go into is, what kind of treatments are people using to treat their condition? And, both on-label drugs, if there is anything developed for the disease, or as well as off-label therapies and other things people are doing to try to help their disease. We want to know how effective these treatments are. And then also, what are hopes for the future? What would people like to see in a new drug? Of all the symptoms of the disease, if there was a new treatment, what symptoms would be the most impactful if there was a new drug to treat them? The outcome of these meetings is that usually we hire a medical writer, and they summarize the entire day into a report. The reports are called Voice of the Patient reports. It's an entire summary of the day with a lot of quotes. The report is organized into a thematic analysis of the different topics that were spoken about. And then each of those themes is supported by direct quotes from patients and caregivers to help illustrate the points. At the end of the report, we use the FDA's benefit risk evaluation that they actually use when reviewing new drugs. And we try to take things that we've learned from the patients and the caregivers, and insert that into the FDA's typical analysis of the benefits and risks of new drugs that they always have to analyze when they're considering to approve a new treatment. These voice of the patient reports, they live in the public domain, and the meetings as well are in the public domain. Due to COVID, these meetings have been occurring virtually, but it's been a very successful process. And the Phelan or the CureSHANK group has decided to take this on as a project. They're actually part of an elite group of rare disease, groups. There's, like I said, there's only been 55 out of the 7,000 rare diseases. So they're in some ways pioneers in this area. We plan to have the meeting in November of this year. It will be a virtual meeting from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. And we look forward to, we're in the process of organizing the meeting, and I've been a consultant to that process. What often comes up, people ask, well, how does the FDA use this information, when they learn from patients? I'll give you an example. There's a rare disease called epidermolysis bullosa. It's a rare condition where children are born and they're missing large parts of their skin, and they tend to get infections that turn into systemic infections, pneumonia. They have to be in isolation. They have horrific wound dressing care that has to be done every day. It's extremely painful. And there's, almost no good treatment for it. And historically, the FDA's wound healing guidance had said that you had to have 100% wound closure for them to approve a new drug for wound healing. So that typically applied to things like ulcers and other types of skin disorders. And after the PFDD meeting, the patient community said that any shrinkage, if we could get 20% shrinkage in the wounds, this would be of great benefit to us. So the FDA actually changed their thinking afterwards and created a separate guidance about wound healing, what was required for wound healing for epidermolysis bullosa. And they have accepted a lower threshold. So it was actually due to patient input that they made this change. And when I was at the agency, I heard from many review staff that when there was a voice of the patient report, they kept it at their desk and they used it as a reference when they were reviewing new products. So this is a very exciting opportunity for the PMS community, and we look forward to moving ahead on this project.
Thank you so much, Larry. We are so excited to work with HPM and with you specifically, and we are just delighted that the FDA accepted our letter of intent so quickly. So we're excited. We're looking forward to an externally led PFDD meeting occurring hopefully around the beginning of November. We're still waiting to hear what the exact date will be. But I think just to go back to Federico's points about the conceptual model, this feeds into the PFDD very nicely. So we kind of know what the general themes are that will be important to tackle. So if we go to the next slide, I'll tell you about another project that's a real complement to the PFDD or externally led PFDD meeting, and it is the development of a series of patient-focused drug development videos, which we're calling Real Family Stories. The two videos at the beginning of the meeting addressing regression and self-harm are the first in the series. We're going to select additional topics that feature the common lived experiences of PMS patients and their families. So we've got epilepsy and communication that we're planning to do, starting to do a little preliminary work on those. But the additional topics have not yet been decided. And that may be something that, as we're working with companies in the consortium, we would talk with you all about some of the topics that might be valuable to create videos about. So the first two videos are already publicly available on the CureSHANK YouTube channel for any companies who may wish to use them for planning purposes, communication with stakeholders, and even for regulatory purposes. Okay, so we are actually doing really good on time. We're like a few minutes ahead of schedule. When does that happen? So before talking about our fourth project and introducing our next speaker, maybe we can just take a break and find out if there are any questions. And just feel free to unmute yourself and ask away if you do have any questions. Okay, well, It doesn't look
I have
like.
one question. I have one question. Hi, this is Suresh from Encoded. I think you mentioned in the first slide, I think there are around 20,000 patients might be diagnosed with SHANK3 mutations. So really, actually, how many patients are now currently available if we had to, consider this as a target?
Right. So in our conversations with the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Foundation, it sounds like there are approximately 3,000 individuals in the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome community. And just kind of based on kind of projections, about 1 in 100 individuals with autism and intellectual disability has a variant of SHANK3 or a deletion of SHANK3. And when you look at, I'm sorry, that is individuals, just under 1% of individuals with autism have the involvement of SHANK3. If you look at individuals who have both autism and intellectual disability, that statistic looks closer to 2%. So that's a pretty large chunk of individuals who either have autism or intellectual disability. So it does make SHANK3 one of the most common causes of neurodevelopmental problems. Alex, I'll let you chime in here if you have anything to add. And Ronnie and Kate, if you have updated statistics, feel free to chime in.
So I think you estimated the prevalence correctly. I think in terms of number of cases, you're just mentioning the US, right? So if you include Europe, I think it can go up to about 4,000, right?
No, our membership is 3,000 worldwide.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the update, Ronnie.
Sure.
But just to clarify, that's just of diagnosed cases. Or yeah, because this condition is so difficult to get diagnosed.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Any other questions? All right. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next topic. Our fourth and final project is the CureSHANK Outcome Measures and Biomarkers Pre-Competitive Consortium, of which today's meeting is the first. To get us started, Dr. Alex Kolovzon is going to discuss the work he, his colleagues, and collaborators have done on outcome measures and biomarkers in the context of the PMS natural history study and several clinical trials he has organized. And there's actually been he has done a lot of work on these topics already. Dr. Kolovzon is a child and adolescent psychiatrist at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, where he is the clinical director of the Seaver Autism Center for Research and Treatment. He's the PI of the Developmental Synaptopathy Consortium's Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Natural History Study. It is a multi-site study funded by the NIH's Rare Disease Clinical Research Network program. Alex, we are glad to have you here today, and I am excited for your presentation.
Thanks, Geraldine. Congratulations, Geraldine, Abby, Paulina, on launching.
Thank you.
I'm really very thrilled to be here.
And we're so glad to have you here.
Alex,
I think you should just be able to show your.
Yeah, I will do. I've never seen my name with a PhD on it. It looks so nice, although I didn't actually earn a PhD, just for clarity. I do have an MD, but
You'll probably get an honorary one at some point. So.
That'd be so nice. Thanks, Paulina.
The preview.
Yeah. So the title is about developing outcome measures, but I thought I would give sort of an overview of our journey to date. Present some of our small successes and then a lot of the challenges and failures, because I think we've definitely learned a lot, but mostly through things that have not worked so well. And the work at Mount Sinai started in about 2010 with a mouse, and then very soon after led to phenotyping with patients and then a clinical trial. But in about 2013 or 2014, Geraldine approached me and said, listen, we really need to put in for this Rare Disease Research Consortium. I think Phelan-McDermid Syndrome should be the lead, and I think you should lead it. I was terrified. I thought we were nowhere near ready for this. And of course, Geraldine didn't take no for an answer. So she rallied a couple of other groups, including the P10 group and the TSC group. And we put together this really lovely, amazing developmental synaptopathies consortium that focuses on Phelan-McDermid syndrome, TSC, and P10. And really the goal from the very outset was to establish a clinical trials network. We wanted a group of expert sites that knew these kids, that understood clinical trials, and that started seeing people so that we were ready once actually viable drug candidates became available. And our goals were pretty straightforward. We wanted to comprehensively characterize the phenotype. We wanted to study the natural history. We've had now 2 iterations of this consortium. The first iteration focused on using imaging as a biomarker, and I'll talk a little bit about what we found there. And then the second iteration, which started about 3 years ago, has shifted its focus to using a lot of EEG or electrophysiology as biomarkers. And then the initial aim wanted to explore second hits. We did a fair amount of whole exome sequencing to see if there were other genes, both in the region, but also across the genome, that could have an impact on the phenotype. And then that aim sort of shifted in the second iteration to developing consensus guidelines with support from the foundation, where we really want to develop a comprehensive clinical model that will inform assessment, monitoring, treatment, and then of course, eventually future clinical trials. And this work is now all underway, and I'll present a little bit of it. The sites are Mount Sinai, Rush, Boston Children's, NIH, and Stanford, led by John Bernstein, Audrey Thurm, Sid Srivastava, Mustafa Sahin, Latha Soria, Elizabeth Barry Kravis. And our goal for the first iteration was to follow 100 kids, and we were successful. We continue now to follow these 100 kids, and we're going to enroll another 90. I think we're about halfway there of the second 90. So this should be a cohort of about 190 patients, all of whom will have at least data every year for 3 years, and about half of whom should have data every year for 5 years. So it's going to be a very, very robust data set, and we're already learning a lot from it. And again, the critical piece here is to understand the natural history. This is so important to really clarify the phenotype, obviously. We need to make sure that we're identifying the right targets for interventions. We don't want to be picking targets that are unstable, essentially. We want to be picking targets that are also common across the population. We want to do more to understand various demographic, genetic, environmental, other variables that correlate with disease outcomes. And our main driver, of course, is to develop best clinical practices and new treatments. So we spent a lot of time thinking through our phenotyping battery, and this is challenging. I think for us, we wanted to think carefully about things that were potentially tractable in the context of clinical trials. We focused a lot, obviously, on behaviors. We focused a lot on things that we thought might potentially move in the context of treatment. So we weren't going to be targeting, reflux. We weren't going to be targeting low muscle tone, but we were thinking about targeting things like language, obviously cognition, autism symptoms, and then various aberrant behaviors, sleep. And then as it's become more and more evident, regression has become a really, really important thing that we're trying to better understand. So we have a broad assessment battery across many different domains. The other challenge that I'll mention is that most of these tools have been validated in autism and developmental disability. None have been validated in Phelan-McDermid syndrome. And I think that the intellectual disability and the language delays really kind of pose a really significant challenge, and I think call many of our measures into question as far as their validity in this particular population. So we've done now a lot to sort of test specific tools previously validated, but for Phelan-McDermid syndrome. I thought it would be worth just kind of going through some of what we learned in terms of the medical features, because this is now the largest cohort to date that's been prospectively assessed. And I think what we've essentially done is confirmed a lot of what's been known based on decades now of literature. But things like hypotonia are very, very common. Gastrointestinal dysfunction, very, very common. Apraxia, ataxia, poor feeding, recurring infections. These are all, really, really common medical features. There were no major surprises here, except, perhaps some of the things you hear a lot about, like lymphedema, was actually pretty uncommon in our group. And none of the kids that we saw, none of the 190, this is, by the way, a combination of patients that were recruited as part of the DSC and also recruited as part of CBER Autism Center studies prior to the DSC. So this total cohort was about 170, and not everybody has all the different measures, but you see the denominator in the left-hand column. None of these kids had zero dysmorphic features. So the dysmorphic features, I think there's a lot of attention paid to these things. I'm not sure how critical they are. We're pretty convinced at this point that there are none that are specific. All kids have them. I mean, everybody has them if you look closely enough. But this is one stuff that we saw. Some of the other medical features, so disrupted sleep, huge problem, not just for the kids, but obviously for the parents as well. Pica, anxiety, comorbid severe mental illness. This is things like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. This is present in about 10% of the cohort, which is pretty significant. Depression, OCD features, these are all relatively common features. We certainly learned that developmental milestones were profoundly delayed. So the average age of walking, single words, phrase speech, all really profoundly to severely affected in these kids. Only about 26 achieved bladder control, which is also obviously very problematic. And the average age that people started to notice concerns, or the average age at least that we were able to document concerns, was 12 months. And so definitely the delays are evident quite early on. Most of these kids had intellectual disability. They all had some degree of intellectual disability that ranged, but most were sitting in the kind of severe end. So these are IQ developmental quotient estimates. These are standard scores, basically, where 100 is the mean, 15 is the standard deviation. So you see things like full scale verbal and nonverbal IQ all in the very, very low range. Adaptive behavior is also in the lower range, and relatively consistent across the domains. So whether it's communication, daily living skills, or socialization, these kids are all in the pretty moderate to severe end of the spectrum. We have done some work and many of these measures looking at consistency and stability over time, and it does seem as if using things like the Vineland, for example, there is pretty consistent stability over time with repeated measures, which was important for us to learn. Language is profoundly delayed as well. Overall language, more than half the kids were considered to be minimally verbal. So I just wanted to spend a couple minutes on regression. This is something that's really increasingly grabbed our attention as a major concern in Phelan-McDermid syndrome. Clearly, in idiopathic autism, we've already acknowledged for years that regression occurs, although it's a bit of a different regression. I think it occurs a bit earlier. So the mean age of regression in idiopathic autism is about 1.8 years, and about 30% of kids overall lose some skills, whether it's language skills or social skills. In Phelan-McDermid syndrome, there's been only a couple of small studies. John Bernstein's group put this out where they were looking at the ADIR and asking questions about language regression. And they found that in Phelan-McDermid syndrome, the average age of onset of regression was about 6 years old, that 43% of cases were considered to be regressed. So these are kids that probably had at least 5 words and were using them consistently for about 3 months and then stopped using them. But other domains that were affected were motor, self-help, and importantly, about 40% of the kids actually regained skills in this study. John looked at, and his group looked at the relationship between regression and seizures, and there was no significant relationship. They also didn't find any significant relationship between the presence of regression and deletion size. And now actually in subsequent studies with larger samples, we are seeing a clear relationship. So I'll present some of that in a minute. By the way, if anybody wants to interrupt me, I can't see anybody on the screen except for Geraldine and like 5 people. So I keep hoping this is gonna be my last Zoom presentation ever, but I'll just muddle through. But open your mic and yell at me if you want me to say something again, or if I'm speaking too quick. So in preliminary data from the RDCR and from the DSC, we did see that about 26% of these kids had language regression and 42% had overall regression. So numbers that were slightly higher than what you would expect in idiopathic autism. This is just again, based on an ADI regression supplement. This is not a perfect measure by any means. 38% of caregivers indicated that at least one skill had been lost at some point, and social communication domain was lost in about the same amount. Motor skills also were lost in a percentage of kids. But the most common skill that was lost was babbling. So these are kids that were babbling. These are sort of, kids they weren't using words consistently, so you can sort of question exactly how regression is operationalized, but they were babbling consistently and lost the babble. So this continues to be an area of really important focus for us. And then related to this, later adolescence, we're seeing regression in kids as well. And that regression is often accompanied by pretty profound neuropsychiatric changes. So this is a really nice study led by Tacey Kohlenberg, where she specifically queried parents asking for people to participate on the basis of having a child with psychiatric problems. This is a biased selected sample focused on trying to better understand the phenotype around neuropsychiatric problems. But here the mean age of participants was 24 years old, but they were presenting with an average of 15 years old is when the kind of neuropsychiatric symptoms started. And among the neuropsychiatric symptoms, we're talking about things like mania, depression, catatonia at about half the group. And again, this is clearly associated with regression. The other important thing that was really first coming out of this study is that females were overrepresented. This is one of the few places in Phelan-McDermid syndrome where there's clear sex differences, and that kids with single point mutations or sequence variants were also overrepresented. I think it's important to keep in mind that kids with sequence variants may be higher functioning at baseline, may have more language at baseline. So obviously things like regression are going to be easier to pick up, but nonetheless, it does seem to be that the kids with the sequence variant are at higher risk. This is the largest study that I'm aware of to look prospectively at genotype-phenotype correlations. And this has been published, I think it was published last year. And so what you see is a few features that we think are important, like IQ, DQ, being clearly associated with smaller deletions. These are kids in class 1 with either sequence variants affecting only a single base pair or SHANK3 plus 2 or 3 terminal genes, right? So the idea that you have only SHANK3, ACR, RABL2B, ARSA, those are the only genes that are affected in these class 1 deletions versus larger deletions, which is essentially everybody else. But actually, this is one of the first times that I remember seeing this, where renal abnormalities were more common among those with large deletions. Cardiac defects, which we always thought were more common among those with large deletions, were actually not significantly different in this group. No major differences in dysmorphic features. Kids with smaller deletions and sequence variants were much more likely to have severe mental illness. Motor milestones, so they were walking earlier in the smaller deletion group. They had more language in the smaller deletion group. They had more phrase speech in the smaller deletion group. They had higher IQs and so on. And then again, as I mentioned, the presence of language regression, in part because they've already developed language, obviously, was much more common among the smaller deletion group. And there was no difference in the rate of autism diagnosis either. So this is like important, I think, in part because we want to be able to start predicting course of illness and predicting what kinds of things are really important to monitor. And there's a lot of other data here that I'm happy to share that we can pull off the web. All right, so outcome measures. This is the key, right? We could have the best medicine in the whole wide world. It could even be a gene therapy. It could be disease modifying. And it's not quite clear to me that we have the right measures to actually see change over time, especially not in the short term. So one of the first things we did was just take validated tools that we thought reflected the phenotype in Phelan-McDermid syndrome and said, hey, is this tool relevant for Phelan-McDermid syndrome? I think the first foray into this was the sensory profile. This was done by a medical student at the time. Just gonna move my thing. And this is, I think, we had the sense that repetitive behaviors and sensory sensitivities in Phelan-McDermid syndrome were a little bit different, right? This idea of having a high pain threshold, were these kids hypo-reactive? And this is a study with 24 kids with Phelan-McDermid syndrome compared to 61 kids with idiopathic autism, where we found that overall, kids with Phelan-McDermid syndrome actually had less sensory sensitivity. So here, higher scores actually reflect more typical sensory sensitivities, but they had very clearly more low energy or weak symptoms compared to idiopathic autism. So this is kind of the one little important clue. It told us, A, this was a decent measure in this group. B, it's actually picking up a relatively unique signature within Phelan-McDermid syndrome as it relates to sensory reactivity. Sid Srivastava from the Harvard group, as part of our DSC, put together a really nice study looking at the repetitive behavior scale, another validated tool in intellectual disability and autism. And what you see here is comparisons with our cohort, across cohorts with idiopathic autism, and other cohorts with just developmental disability. And overall, on the RBS, this is 90%. This is 90 participants, by the way, with Phelan-McDermid syndrome. So it's a big study. But what we found was that repetitive behaviors are actually significantly less severe in PMS compared to autism more broadly. This is regardless of IQ, importantly. And then when you look sort of specifically at IQ, it seemed that the IQ correlated with the degree of stereotypic behaviors, although in general, the stereotypic behaviors were not that much more significantly effective. So, the RBS has moved in some clinical trials. I think it reflects the phenotype to an extent, but it's just important to keep in mind that, even though this is a core autism symptom, kids with PMS are much less severely affected than what you would predict based on idiopathic autism or developmental disability in general. The SRS, another extremely common tool. Actually, our first iteration, this is the social responsiveness scale. The first iteration of our DSC, this kind of falls into the bucket of failures. The first iteration of our DSC used the SRS. I should say also that one of the challenges of the DSC is we wanted to use measures that were relevant not just to Phelan-McDermid syndrome, but also to PTEM and TSC. And so we had spent a lot of time debating the SRS. Many questions on the social responsiveness scale are language-based. And although it's been validated in autism, and there's been a sort of shortened version that's been studied in autism with intellectual disability, we weren't convinced that this was especially relevant of a tool. And in fact, it had limited utility in PMS, right? Most of the respondents endorsed the greatest severity of autism symptoms. So there was a real ceiling effect. That's despite only about 60% meeting criteria for autism. And there was really no difference in the mean SRS score between autism and not within PMS. So, there were some limitations. It was relatively small sample size, less than 100. And there was good retest reliability. We're just not sure how well this actually reflects the phenotype, mostly because so many items reference verbal abilities. So this is now something we've actually dropped in the second iteration of the DSC, and I'm sure to many parents' enthusiasm, because they don't have to fill out this scale that feels quite irrelevant to their kids. So the other question is, can we sort of take other more broader scales and then refine them to be more specific to the phenotype in Phelan-McDermid syndrome? And this has been work that's been done in Rett syndrome and Angelman syndrome, where just a very basic clinical global impression scale has been sort of adapted in essence to try to capture domains that are specific, in this case, to Angelman syndrome. And it's based on enormous amounts of work that talks to parents, talks to clinicians, talks to experts in the field, tries to figure out exactly what are the critical domains that we want to be thinking about, and then it develops a scale based on those domains with really nice anchors so that everybody who's using the scale is rating people similarly. I think I saw Nancy Jones on this call, so Nancy, and I think I saw Joe Horgan on the call also. Nancy and Joe developed a great Fragile X rating syndrome scale years ago for one of their trials, and then Nancy has now taken her efforts to Phelan-McDermid syndrome as part of the NEURIN clinical trial efforts and developed a CGI specifically for Phelan-McDermid syndrome, which is really nicely operationalized and anchored. And Latha Sori and Elizabeth Berry-Kravis and I helped out. And this is going to be a tool that's going to get piloted in their phase 2 trial with NNZ 2591. So I'm really excited about this tool, and Nancy's given us permission to use it as well. So I think this is a really promising new direction. Oh, and by the way, the CGI is very, very well established in clinical trials and psychopharmacology in general. So we also thought a lot about how do we measure objectively things like social attention, right? And this is a really cool paradigm that was developed by Jerry Dawson for kids with idiopathic autism, but young kids, where it's kind of modeled a little bit after the ADOS, and various social and non-social sounds are played within the room, and you measure sort of latency to respond. And so we were hoping that this was a really nice objective way to show differences over the course of a trial in terms of social orienting, essentially. And we did a relatively big study comparing the responses to the social orienting tasks in Phelan-McDermid syndrome as compared to idiopathic autism. This is actually a paper that's still under review. And I mean, the net of it is that we didn't find that kids with Phelan-McDermid syndrome really selectively responded to either social or non-social. So that what one would predict certainly what occurred in idiopathic autism is that kids were more selectively responding to non-social cues, so like a bell ringing, for example, or a doorbell. And in Phelan-McDermid syndrome, they were sort of indiscriminately responding, so it was very hard to predict. And we actually we piloted this in the context of a clinical trial, and we really didn't see any significant change. And it's not a trivial task to administer. And because we weren't seeing any clear differences in Phelan-McDermid syndrome, we ended up abandoning it. So this is another one we can put in the learned a lot and abandoned column. Language environment analysis. This got a lot of attention for many years, and it was developed in very, very young kids. This is basically an audio recorder that's worn in the vest of a child, and it can record, I think, up to 12 or maybe even 24 hours of language. And it's supposed to be able to distinguish between a key child and a parent. It's supposed to be able to tell you, how many turns are taken in a conversation, quality of vocalizations. And it loads all the data onto this little recorder, and then it filters it through a software program, and it spits it out in a really beautiful, quantifiable way. So we took 18 kids with Phelan-McDermid syndrome. We, I think, recorded over 500 hours of audio. We then randomly selected audio from the system, and then we compared it to a human transcriber. And unfortunately, what we found was that the machine only really correctly identified the key child in 40% of the cases. And they did a much better job with much younger kids, and the machine did a much better job when there wasn't a lot of inappropriate vocalizations. And so, we learned something in the sense that if we're going to be doing language studies, maybe this is a good tool, but really only for very young kids, because that's how it was developed, and also only for kids that don't have a lot of inappropriate speech. So another one in sort of the fail column. Motor skills. So we know so much about gait disturbances in Phelan-McDermid syndrome, but how do you measure it, right? Because the naked eye, I think, does a terrible job, especially if you think about clinical trials. How do you think about subtle changes in gait, for example? So we partnered with the Rutgers group and Elizabeth Torres and assessed walking patterns in 16 kids with Phelan-McDermid syndrome, compared them to 11 age-matched controls. And here, data is collected using all these sensors. So it's kind of analyzing angular motion of various joints. So you can look at the head, the thorax, the lumbar, the shoulders, the knees, and it's really unbelievably cool. And it creates these avatars so you can truly quantify so many different elements of gait. And they essentially kind of create what's called a signature of jitter fluctuations. And we saw quite clearly that kids with Phelan-McDermid syndrome had increased fluctuations in their movements, much more randomness to their movement than the controls. And so the hope was that over the course of a trial, you might see kind of a normalization of gait, so decrease in jitter fluctuations. We saw some signs of this actually in one small trial with IGF-1, but it really ends up being such a challenging procedure, and we just felt like the signal wasn't strong enough and there wasn't enough promise to continue pursuing it, although I still really like this idea of trying to measure gait in a more objective way. And I think there's probably, since this study was published, which was back in, I don't have it written down, it's just at least 5 years ago, there's probably much better technology. So I'm certainly open to thinking more about this. Eye tracking is an outcome measure. Everyone loves eye tracking, right? This is another really nice objective way to try to capture things like attention, social attention, recognition memory. So we spent a fair amount of time piloting several different tasks, and probably got the most traction out of the visual paired comparison task. So here there's kind of two identical stimuli, either faces or patterns that are presented side by side. And then one face or one pattern is replaced by something new, and you kind of measure the saccade to try to gauge preference for novelty, which is what you would anticipate. So we did a study looking at 22 kids with Phelan-McDermid syndrome compared to 38 kids with idiopathic autism. And even though we had some nice kind of early signals, we did find that the group with Phelan-McDermid syndrome and autism actually spent much less time viewing social versus non-social images. So there's something going on there for sure. And actually within the Phelan-McDermid syndrome group, both those with and without autism look more similar than when you would compare them to people with autism, idiopathic autism. So there is something that's distinguishing these folks in terms of the deficits and looking at social stimuli. This is an automatic objective measure. So I think this is something that we're going to continue pursuing in the context of clinical trials. And we're going to try to, I think, refine the paradigm a little bit, because as you can see, was one example, all the social stimuli are black and white. We borrowed this from, I think, a Rett syndrome study, whereas some of the non-social stimuli are in colors. So it just felt to us like there may be some bias there. So we're kind of changing this paradigm around and going to continue to use it. Oh, here's brand new data. This is going to be presented next month at INSAR. So pupillary light reflex, also people are very excited about this, right? This is acetylcholine mediated response that's supposed to play a role in excitatory inhibitory balance, which is obviously relevant for Phelan-McDermid syndrome. Previous studies suggest clear differences in autism compared to typical controls. We looked at 18 kids with idiopathic autism, 16 with Phelan-McDermid syndrome, and 18 controls, all age matched. And that we didn't see any significant differences in the latency to the pupil contraction, but kids with Phelan-McDermid syndrome had significantly less contraction compared to smaller contraction compared to typical controls. It looked more similar to idiopathic autism. It was actually less contraction, but there wasn't a significant difference. The only difference that we really saw was between Phelan-McDermid syndrome and control. Also, another pretty easy measure, and do it in the context of eye tracking, and something that you might see change over the course of treatment. We didn't do this pre-post clinical trials, but we are now. Okay, so the SAN, I think people have heard about this. Sensory sensitivity, super, super important domain, affects virtually all of our kids. As I said, there's kind of a unique signature within Phelan-McDermid syndrome that's kind of reflective of hyposensitivity. So this is the first known assessment that combines a clinician-administered observation with a caregiver interview, similar to the ADOS. We know that it's appropriate for use in severely affected and minimally verbal kids. It's now been published 2 or even 3 times in Phelan-McDermid syndrome and in other single gene forms of autism. We know that children with autism show increased sensory reactivity, and that children with Phelan-McDermid syndrome also do, but specifically around hyporeactivity. I also think that there's some potential for this tool, not just as a clinical research outcome measure, but also as a clinical measure by itself. This is data from the sensory reactive. This is from the SAND in Phelan-McDermid syndrome, where you see across virtually all domains, there's decreased reactivity. We've piloted this in several different clinical trials in Phelan-McDermid syndrome and in other conditions. And early data seems to suggest that it is sensitive to change with treatment. So that's also quite exciting for us. It's relatively easy to administer once you get trained. But in like a small subset of kids for whom we did this pre and post treatment with IGF-1, we saw significant improvement in the total score, driven to a large extent by improvement in the hyperreactivity score. So all that kind of put that in the win column, I would say. I have 10 minutes. No, I have a little more than 10 minutes. I think I'll get through it. I have about 10 more slides. Okay, so we talked about sort of these clinical outcome assessments, thinking a lot about more objective assessments, but still not quite in the realm of what would be considered truly biomarker. So as I said, the first biomarker efforts as part of the DSC revolved around imaging. Everybody loves imaging. I'm not as enthusiastic about imaging, especially as it relates to clinical trials, because it's very hard to repeat imaging. And in Phelan-McDermid syndrome, as you know, these kids all have to be sedated to get accurate scans. So it's not the greatest tool, although it can teach us something. I just don't think it's going to be extremely relevant for trials. But I'll go through some of the data. So in Phelan-McDermid syndrome, probably at least a half a dozen studies, if not more, highlight some structural changes on MRI, like thinning of the corpus callosum, enlarged ventricles, cerebellar hypoplasia. Sid Srivastava from the Boston group, as part of the DSC, looked at just structural volumetric analyses of the basal ganglia and cerebellar structures compared to controls, and found that those patients with PMS had decreased caudate, decreased putamen, and decreased left palatal volumes compared to controls, and that the cerebellum volume loss actually correlated with increased repetitive behavior. So to me, this is something that's a little bit interesting, right? The idea that you can see volumetric changes that actually correlate with clinical symptoms, that's what makes, at least to me anyway, the biomarkers the most powerful, is that they can't just be isolated changes. They have to reflect something about the clinical phenotype that we think is important. So that was kind of a neat little finding. Actually, before that, our group back in 2014-15, and then published in 2016, did resting state and looked at functional studies with a passive listening task. And again, these kids are under some light sedation, so we're playing them communicative and non-communicative sounds. And this is work that was done by Ting Wang at the time. And what Ting found was that actually communicative vocal sounds elicited greater activation in the superior temporal gyrus compared to non-communicative vocal sounds. And that's compared to an idiopathic autism group that really didn't activate at all in response to the communicative sounds. And so, I like to think about this as sort of a hope that some of the language centers are actually intact, and that maybe some of the language deficits are driven by, motor issues and less by brain issues. But this was a kind of a neat study. We have not repeated this. We did do DTI though as well, and scanned about 11 kids with Phelan-McDermid syndrome and 9 with idiopathic autism, and showed significantly reduced fractional anisotropy or FA bilaterally in the PMS group relative to the ASD group. And that's marked because we know already that in ASD there's decreased FA in most long-range tracks. But this is a small sample. Again, it's not, I don't think, as valuable of a biomarker in the context of clinical trials, but these data do suggest that the white matter integrity may be even more deficient in Phelan-McDermid syndrome as compared to idiopathic autism. Sid also did was this Sid? Julia, I think, yes, Sid is the second author, did a DTI study as part of the DSC. This is with a separate 10 participants with PMS. This was published back in 2020. Among the PMS group, 8 of them actually had autism, and the comparison was age-matched controls. And what you see is that there's a decrease in the uncinate fasciculus in the FA measure, and an increase in the mean diffusivity measure. So that the top 2 figures here show the FA on the left and right. The bottom 2 show the diffusivity measure on the left and the right as well. So again, clear differences between Phelan-McDermid syndrome and idiopathic. Sorry, this is not an idiopathic autism group. This is a healthy control group. Okay, so electrophysiology. This is, I think, what I'm probably most enthusiastic about from a biomarker perspective. But we've always had the hope that electrophysiology could serve to identify subtypes of developmental disorders based on these EI profiles. We would hope that they could inform personalized treatment approaches, to monitor treatment, to stratify subgroups. And then, of course, it's really important to try to identify associations between electrophysiological responses and clinical outcomes. And I think where we've seen, and people have heard me present about this, I'm sure, I think where we've seen the most kind of traction is around the work that Paige Seiper has done with visual evoked potentials. So these are non-invasive techniques to evaluate the functional integrity of visual pathways. They're recorded from the scalp and just using 3 electrodes in response to a contrast reversing checkerboard. The VP reflects the sum of excitatory and inhibitory activity. Oops, sorry. And inhibitory activity. I'm just gonna move something around so I can show you my mouse. And these peaks and troughs reflect cellular events. So the idea is that this peak between P60, or the trough rather between P60 and N75, reflects excitatory drive or glutamatergic activity, and the P100 peak reflects the inhibitory response. And so you take any person on this Zoom call, or even any infant, they show a very characteristic signature with a nice balanced excitatory drive and inhibitory response. Given the biology of Phelan-McDermid syndrome and the absence of, or the deficiency around SHANK3, which is this kind of glutamatergic anchoring protein, what we see in Phelan-McDermid syndrome is a real flattening of the glutamatergic peak. So you really see almost no N75, and as a result, the inhibitory response is also suppressed. And when you look at that and compare it to idiopathic autism, typically developing controls, siblings of kids with Phelan-McDermid syndrome, you repeatedly see significant reductions in the amplitude of the N75 peak and sort of decreased glutamatergic drive in Phelan-McDermid syndrome. We can look at the relationship between sensory activity across groups even, and we see that that amplitude of the glutamatergic peak is associated with less less reactivity or hypo-reactivity in essence. So again, the idea that the biomarker is actually correlated to a clinical symptom. We can put this pre and post treatment, and this is again a very small subset, but we see that IGF-1 is associated with an increased excitatory drive and changes in the frequency on some of the frequency bands in response to the VEP. So we do see this as kind of a promising marker, and we've embedded it in our DSC, and it's embedded in virtually all of our clinical trials. The other thing that's worth noting is the importance of maintaining this relationship between Phelan-McDermid syndrome and idiopathic autism, because idiopathic autism or autism in general is just so kind of known, right? These kids will hopefully respond to similar behavioral interventions. It's the, SHANK3 is one of the most common causes of autism. And so we think that we can use some of these biomarkers to actually parse the broader autism phenotype. So if we can develop treatments for Phelan-McDermid syndrome, the hope would be that we could use biomarkers, including the VEP, to actually try to stratify idiopathic autism and select who among people with idiopathic autism might respond to similar treatments. And when we do VEPs across larger samples of idiopathic autism, we see that about half of the people with idiopathic autism actually fall within 1 standard deviation of the PMS amplitude mean on the glutamatergic peak. So we call these folks kind of PMS-like. And so then the idea would be to do clinical trials with PMS, clinical trials with idiopathic autism using the same compound, who are PMS-like, and then obviously comparisons also to idiopathic autism that are not PMS-like, with the hypothesis that they would not respond. Hope that makes sense. I got excited about that, so I started speaking to it. And then, of course, other sensory domains, auditory event-related potentials. So we piloted this using these repeated tones in Phelan-McDermid syndrome. And the first few patients, we were like so super excited because the kids with Phelan-McDermid syndrome were characterized by very attenuated amplitude in your initial tones and then delayed habituation. And so we're like, oh, this is another really cool signature, this kind of amplitude change and habituation difficulties. So we did a larger study in 15 participants with PMS, 15 with idiopathic autism, and 16 with typical development. This was actually just published. The proofs, this may not even be online yet, but it's in the proof stage. But sadly, when we did larger groups across conditions, we actually did not see any significant differences between groups, so that both the PMS and the idiopathic autism group showed robust responses to the initial tone and decaying or habituation responses to subsequent tones, similar to the typically developing group. So that was disappointing. But then when you started to kind of parse it a bit and look only within the Phelan-McDermid syndrome group, it does seem that the PMS group had the greater N1 amplitude in particular was correlated with auditory hyperreactivity on our SAN measure, and that the reduced P2 habituation was correlated with the severity of autism symptoms. So this is kind of a way to maybe dig a little bit deeper and think about if you could still maybe use this as a biomarker, even if it doesn't distinguish between idiopathic autism and Phelan-McDermid syndrome. It still might be sensitive to change over time, and importantly, as it's correlated with the clinical outcome. It's 10:23. I think I'm done. Here's my awesome group of dedicated people who love working with kids with Phelan-McDermid syndrome and their families. It's yeah, this is a main focus of the work that we do.
Our 2-minute break. I will ask you a question. Gosh, the regression phenotype is it's going to be confounding in clinical trials. And I think about the DSC. It is a really, really robust study, and you're collecting you have a lot of time points where you're collecting data. Do you feel like that's sufficient to really get a grasp on the regression phenotype and when it occurs? And what would it take to really understand sort of that, have you thought about, are there any ideas out there to address that concern?
Yeah, I mean, the answer to your first question is no. I don't think the DSC is going to be robust enough. I think in the second iteration of the DSC, we added 4 or 5 measures that speak to regression. So there'll be some more. But we would have to get almost a little bit lucky. If we were to look at kids over this 5 years, we'd have to see them pre and post in order to learn the most. More of what we're doing is just kind of after they regress or after they change, then we're calling them in, and so much of it's kind of retrospective. So that's definitely a limitation. The Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Foundation just funded a young investigator to study exactly the kind of neuropsychiatric changes that we're seeing in adults. And we have this ECHO PMS group also that's now seen, I think, 34 or 35 cases. And so the goal there is to kind of better understand the themes around these neuropsychiatric presentations, almost all of which come with some degree of significant regression, to develop a better tool that we can use for caregivers and clinicians to kind of get them to complete it and sort of better understand the scope of the phenotype. And then even more importantly, we make these specific recommendations and we've come up with some sort of treatment guidelines. After those treatment guidelines are implemented, are we doing better, right? I mean, what works, what doesn't work? And then I think the step after that would be, oh, if this is working, like just as a crude example, if lithium helps or ECT helps or Ativan helps, then we could do a clinical trial with a subset of kids based on what we think is going to be helpful. And then we've actually got like the first evidence-based treatment for a specific feature of Phelan-McDermid syndrome. And there's already one study published with IVIG in a group of, I think, 6 kids with Phelan-McDermid syndrome who had a pretty significant regression with catatonia, and it definitely, according to this small study, it helped. Yeah.
Kudos to PMSF for funding the young.
Kudos to PMSF. Yeah.
They're going to be funding the work on regression. So that's exciting. I wondered, have you ever thought about sort of the use of apps, daily tracking apps or anything like that parents can use to report symptoms or things that are going on to better understand maybe the regression and sort of the trajectory of the disorder?
Yeah, I think technology is really a great idea. I think it really is important to engage families both in the context of their ongoing clinical care, but also in the context of clinical trials. When we have people in trials, they're sending me their observations, but we don't really have a good sort of standardized tool. But I think that's a great endeavor for sure.
Lots of families are very tech savvy and would welcome that kind of an approach.
Totally, yeah. I mean, just like videos, right? If I could see videos of the same gait exercise, for example, that's also really valuable.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Alex. Okay, Rudy's bio break is over now. Okay, so our main purpose today is to tell you about the consortium and invite you to consider becoming a member. So before we open up for the group discussion, I just want to share some of our preliminary ideas about the consortium. So we're envisioning the mission of the consortium will be to facilitate a cooperative, globally aligned effort focused on the identification and development of novel approaches to enable successful clinical trials. In the simplest terms, we want to bring together interested companies to work collaboratively on the development and validation of outcome measures and biomarkers. So if we go to the next slide, having had the chance to talk with many companies over the last few years, the conversations have been very similar and they've usually converged on outcome measures and biomarkers. And as we all know, clinical trials and disorders of the brain are hard. They're costly and don't always end in success. But your success is our success. And by working together, we believe we will get there faster, cheaper, and more efficiently. So when we conceptualized the idea of the consortium, we saw its most essential function is providing a forum and a process for discussion, guidance, and feedback among participants. An important goal would be to enhance drug development by reducing the chances of failure of clinical trials. Another important goal would be to develop new enabling technologies. Here, we think we can reduce redundancies and cost and improve efficiencies by all of us working together. The final big goal we sort of envisioned was to gain the acceptance of new technologies by regulators and industry more widely by facilitating the development of standards and practices and fostering communication with regulatory agencies. These are merely our starting ideas, but we look forward to working with those of you who are interested in joining the consortium to crystallize the goals. Let's go to the next slide. So CureSHANK is going to put our money where our mouth is. We are prepared to fund a program manager, to establish consortium agreements, and to facilitate communication and meetings. Again, your success benefits our children, so we are certainly open to other roles that may be advantageous or appropriate for CureSHANK to take on. And now let's go to the final slide. We'd like to open up the meeting now for group discussion. And we understand that a decision to participate in the consortium will take some discussion within your company, but we're very curious to see if there is any shared interest in any particular outcome measures or biomarkers. We'd love to hear more about what you're interested in. So to get the discussion going, I've listed a few conversation starters. please just feel free to unmute yourself and share your thoughts. And by no means should the conversation be limited to just these ideas. So, and also, since we didn't do a Q&A with Alex, you're welcome to ask him questions as well. So.
Hi, I have one question for Alex. Alex, a great presentation and good to see some electrophysiological biomarkers. Are you planning to look at any like fluid biomarkers like serum or CSF biomarkers? Or do you see any challenges actually to go after these fluid biomarkers in these patients?
You said CSF and what was the biomarker?
Serum biomarkers.
Oh, serum. So CSF, I think no, just because it's sort of the risk benefit, unless there's something really compelling. Serum biomarkers, you know, when we do IGF-1 studies, we look at pre-post IGF-1 levels, we look at pre-post binding protein levels. So I think if there's something specific to drug mechanism, that would be informative. And I'm open to other ideas. I mean, I think people are interested in immune markers, for example. It's not challenging for us to get blood. We get blood as part of clinical trials all the time. So if there's a compelling biomarker, let's add it.
Alex, what are you hearing from families about the biomarker studies? What do they think about? I know you love electrophysiology. I'm not sure parents do, or families do, right? It involves a little wrangling of kids, right? Most of these kids have sensory issues, right? They don't love things being stuck to their head. So tell me about, like, with electrophysiological biomarkers and some of the other ones that you've looked at, what have sort of been the experiences of the patients and their parents?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think so. There's a little bit of a bias in the sense that I don't think parents would be complaining bitterly to me. And so perhaps my experience of it is rosier than their experience of it. I can tell you that we're very successful at capturing results, and it's not trivial, right? So that 75–80% of the time we actually get meaningful results. So they're able to do it. You know, it's completely benign. There's no pain, and it's very brief, right? So I don't think families have a huge problem with it. And, you know, nobody likes to have to do 3 hours of assessments as part of a clinical trial. It's obviously burdensome. There's no question about that, just as the testing is. But I think they appreciate the aims. I think we do a good job of explaining why it's so important. I think they like it better than filling out a 60-item questionnaire that has only 4 items that have anything to do with their kid. You know, so I think in that sense it's less irritating. But I don't want to minimize the burden. But we haven't gotten bitter complaints. We don't have a lot of difficulty recruiting, and, you know, other than COVID, parents are willing, able, and committed to the mission.
Right, for sure. It does seem like families are very enthusiastic about participating.
Bonnie, do you or Kate, do you guys hear people complaining about how tough it is at Mount Sinai? No, okay, good.
No, not at all.
Yeah, I guess as a parent that's participated, you know, I will say I agree with your, you know, it is very annoying to fill out these very long, you know, questionnaires and feel like none of this applies to my child. These questions are so far off base. So what efforts, or is it possible to develop, like, you know, sort of abbreviated versions of some of these widely accepted instruments? Are there ways that we can kind of make this, tailor this to be more PMS specific and more efficient for use in our community?
Yeah, absolutely. I think now that we're kind of moving into the, you know, 150, 160 participant range, we can take things like the RBS, we can take things like the aberrant behavior checklist, we can do kind of more item level analyses. So Sturm, I think is the person's name, who took the SRS, which I think is 65 questions, distilled it down to 17 questions or 16 questions just for people with intellectual disability. That was a kind of a nice refined measure, and not that it was great or effective for Phelan-McDermott syndrome, but I think we can do similar things once we have enough data. We can also do composite measures, right? You can look at the aberrant behavior checklist plus the repetitive behavior scale plus the sensory profile and create a whole new measure just using the raw items. So there's a lot of that promise, but you just need, in order to do it in a meaningful way, you need big numbers, and then we're eventually going to get there.
Great. Have you had any discussions with regulators about doing that yet, or, you know, anything sort of related to this? And if so, what has been sort of their receptivity or their feedback to you?
Not yet. No.
Okay.
no, Joe just popped on. My discussion with regulators has related more to not in Phelan-McDermid syndrome, but in other conditions as it relates to CGI, for example. And they were very, very welcome to that idea of kind of refining existing tools to fit the syndrome phenotype, especially as it concerned getting caregiver feedback around what are meaningful clinical domains.
Okay, and I think that's a potential role for the consortium, right? Is that we could sort of tee up some critical path innovation meetings, if necessary, to talk about sort of the development or the, of kind of, or the revision of some existing instruments that are out there. So just something to keep in mind. So I may ask one or two more questions then. Sleep is a really, really significant problem for patients with Phelan-McDermid syndrome. Alex, have y'all done anything on sleep yet?
So we do measure sleep. We've got a sleep questionnaire as part of the DSE. We haven't done it as like a primary outcome, but I'm, my whole research career started in sleep, actually. So I'm really interested in sleep, and one of our genetic counselors is putting together a small application to start to explore wearables and more objective ways of measuring sleep. So we're definitely in the space. We're not like, we've got a foot in, let's say, but I'm also open to ideas.
I feel like that is an area that could make such an impact for the patients and the families. Yeah. And I wonder, I'm just wondering, we don't have the data to say this, but how improving an issue like sleep could contribute to improvements in other developmental outcomes.
Sure.
So we certainly think a lot about, like you saw Talia's video with self-injurious behavior, and you think about how what is that source of aggression or really challenging behaviors, and how sleep could be contributing to those kinds of things.
Yeah, I would say from like a clinical perspective, we have a pretty sort of deep bench around various options for sleep. And I think we developed some treatment guidelines as part of the ECHO, and when they're implemented effectively, and when clinicians aren't sort of, too wary of using sleep medications in kids, we can do pretty well with treating sleep. And then, yeah, to your point, it's a really important question as to whether that could have a good impact on other developmental outcomes. Certainly, we know that it has a good impact on quality of life, and not just for the kids, but for the parents.
Yeah. Any other questions? Well, we want to thank you all for taking part. I think this is, I had our email address on here, and for some reason that we've had some issues with our slides today, but most of you, I think how to reach me, and we just would welcome any input that you have from today's meeting. Feel free to drop us a message and give any questions, any comments, any thoughts about the consortium. So I just want to end by thanking you on behalf of CureSHANK's board and advisors. And I want to extend a big thanks to all of you for taking part in the meeting today. Big thanks to Federico and Larry, and especially for Alex for presenting today. And we will be following up with all of the participants today in the next couple of weeks to talk to you about your interest in participating in the consortium. And if anything comes up in the meanwhile, please reach out to us, and we will talk to you soon. Thank you so much.